The letter came in an old, yellowed envelope, its edges curled like brittle autumn leaves. Inside, a legal document bore my name in bold print, confirming what the lawyer sitting across from me had just said. Your grandfather wanted you to have the farmhouse. I hadn't seen Willow Creek Estates since I was a kid. Grandpa Joe's farmhouse sat on 5 beautiful acres, its most defining feature being an ancient stone well that had stood for over a century. I remembered the way the stones fell under my hands, as Grandpa showed me how to draw water from it when I was just 8 years old. That well's been here longer than I have, and longer than this town's had a name, he used to say, eyes twinkling. It wasn't just a relic. It was a legacy, supplying a farmhouse with fresh, clean water long before fancy plumbing and homeowners associations existed. 2 months later, I packed up my city apartment and moved in. The farmhouse needed work, but something about the land felt untouched by time, as if the past had settled into the soil and refused to be forgotten. The well, standing proudly in the side yard, was my first priority. I cleared out the overgrown weeds, repaired the wooden roof covering it, and tested the water, pure as ever. I had just finished repainting the farmhouse porch when I noticed a shadow stretching across the ground. Turning around, I found a woman in an expensive-looking tracksuit standing at my fence. Her blonde hair was pulled back into an almost military-type ponytail, and her oversized sunglasses hid her eyes. Even so, I could feel her gaze raking over my property like a vulture sizing up its next meal. You must be Joe's grandchild, she said, arms crossed. I'm Margaret Wilson, vice president of the HOA. She never extended a hand, never smiled, just studied me like I was a stain on her pristine neighborhood. Nice to meet you, I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. Margaret tilted her chin toward the well. That thing is an eyesore. I blinked. Excuse me. The HOA requires uniform landscaping, she continued, her voice sweet like spoiled honey. All water features must be approved. That well, it's non-compliant. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. This property predates the HOA. It's legally exempt. Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. No property is exempt from maintaining community standards. I've already documented multiple violations. She pulled out her phone and snapped pictures before I could say another word. That night, a certified letter slid under my door, listing 3 violations, 1 for non-compliant landscaping, 1 for an unapproved water feature, and 1 for an unsafe structure. Each carried a $100 daily fine. I stared at the paper, blood boiling. Margaret wasn't just power-hungry. She was coming for my home, determined. I dug through Grandpa Joe's old files, my hand shaking as I flipped through documents. And there it was, a signed agreement from 1982, back when developers first built Willow Creek Estates. Grandpa had made sure his property was legally protected, permanently exempt from HOA rules. Armed with evidence, I stormed into the next HOA meeting, a small, stuffy room where Margaret sat ahead of a long table like a self-appointed queen. I placed my documents on the table. This well is legally exempt. You have no authority here. Margaret's smile never faltered, but I saw something flicker behind her eyes. She didn't even read the papers. Instead, she leaned back, folded her arms, and said, "We'll have to verify that with the board's attorney." A slow dread crept into my stomach. She wasn't going to back down. The next morning, my mailbox overflowed with new violation notices, more fabricated fines, more letters from concerned neighbors claiming my property was ruining community aesthetics. It wasn't just about the well anymore. Margaret was declaring war. I wasn't the only one she'd targeted. That evening, an elderly woman knocked at my door. "I saw Margaret at your fence," she said in a hushed voice. "I need to warn you." Her name was Julia Johnson, and she had lived in Willow Creek Estates for 30 years. Last year, while my husband and I were visiting our daughter, she had our koi pond filled in. Julia whispered, hands trembling, claimed it was a mosquito hazard. My stomach twisted. "We fought back, but she buried us in fines," Julia continued. "We lost." I listened, horrified, as she told me about other families who had suffered under Margaret's rule. Mr. Finch's garden shed, torn down. The Parkers' children's play set, demolished. The Rodriguez family's traditional front gate, removed. One by one, she had forced families to comply or leave. That night, I stood by the well, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. My fingers brushed the cold stone, and a terrible thought settled into my bones. Margaret wasn't just enforcing rules. She was systematically erasing history. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls. First, to a water rights attorney. Elaine Morales listened intently before saying, "This exemption is solid, but HOAs can be aggressive. Document everything, every letter, every conversation." Second, to a security company. By sundown, I had hidden cameras installed around my property, some visible, others discreet. Third, to the State Historical Society. An expert explained that hand-dug wells from early settlements were rare and eligible for protection. I filed the historical registration paperwork that same day. Over the next few weeks, Margaret ramped up her harassment, sending inspectors, spreading rumors, and turning some neighbors against me. But I didn't fight back. I waited, because I knew something Margaret didn't. She was about to walk straight into my legal trap, and she wouldn't realize it until it was far too late. The storm had been raging all night. Sheets of rain slammed against my windshield as I pulled into my driveway. Exhausted from a week-long work trip, I had a gut feeling something was wrong before I even stepped out of the car. The headlights swept across my front yard, but something was missing. The well. In its place was something gray and lumpy, a solid slab of concrete standing in complete defiance of its century-old existence. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. The wooden shelter that once protected the well lay in splintered ruins, its beams cracked like broken ribs. My breath hitched. No, no, no. I stumbled forward, dropping to my knees, my fingers scraping across the rough concrete. It was hardened, fully set. Someone had poured an entire truck's worth of cement into my well, sealing it shut forever. A motion sensor light flicked on across the street. Margaret Wilson stood on her porch in a silk bathrobe, holding a cup of tea. Even from a distance, I could see it. She was smiling. I shot to my feet, my body moving before my brain could catch up, storming toward her house. I barely noticed the rain soaking through my clothes. "What did you do?" I shouted. Margaret didn't even flinch. Instead, she took a delicate sip of her tea, her smirk unwavering. "The board voted," she said calmly. "That dangerous hole needed to be addressed for community safety." I clenched my fist so hard my nails dug into my palms. "You had no right. That well is exempt from HOA rules." She disappeared inside her house for a moment, then returned with a folder of documents. She thrust them toward me, her expression as smug as ever. "Emergency action provision. Section 8.3, she recited. "When a hazardous condition presents immediate risk, the board may take corrective measures. We sent multiple notices. Your continued noncompliance forced our hand." I snatched the papers from her hands. The signatures were all dated after I had left for my trip. I felt sick. Margaret had waited until I was gone, just like she did with the Johnsons' koi pond, the Parkers' playset, the Rodriguez's gate. She planned this, and she thought she had won. But Margaret didn't know about my security cameras. That night, I sat in my living room, soaked and shaking as I scrubbed through the footage. There it was, Margaret Wilson, standing in my yard, directing a concrete truck onto my property. The driver looked hesitant, but Margaret shoved a stack of papers in his face, pointing to the well with that same entitled authority. 2 workers poured the cement in broad daylight, while Margaret stood by with her arms crossed, watching. My hands shook with rage. It wasn't just an abuse of power. This was criminal property destruction. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to end her reign of terror. Elaine Morales, my attorney, nearly dropped her coffee when she saw the footage. "This is far beyond HOA authority," she said, rewinding the video for the 3rd time. "Even with an emergency provision, permanently destroying a water source is illegal. And given that your well was just approved for historical protection, that makes this even worse." I frowned. Historical protection? I thought that took months to process. Elaine grinned. "It was approved 3 days ago." My eyes widened. Margaret had destroyed my well at the worst possible time for herself. We're filing today, Elaine said, gathering the documents. This isn't just a civil case anymore. This is criminal vandalism of a historical site. By afternoon, the lawsuit was in motion. By evening, the neighborhood knew about it. The next morning, my phone rang. Thomas Reed, HOA president. Listen, he started, his voice hesitant. Several board members want to talk. I met them that afternoon at Thomas's house, where 3 other board members sat around his dining table, looking like kids caught cheating on a test. Margaret showed us different paperwork than what she filed. Thomas admitted. She said it was just going to be a safety cover. We never approved concrete. I stared at them, waiting for an apology. None came. Will you testify to that? I asked. Thomas exhaled sharply. Yes. The cracks in Margaret's armor were starting to show, but she wasn't done yet. That night, I heard the crash before I saw it. Glass shattered across my living room floor, and a brick landed at my feet. A note was tied around it. Drop the lawsuit, or worse will happen. I stared at the words, my pulse pounding. I stepped outside, scanning the street. Margaret's porch light was still on, but the curtains were drawn. I knew she was behind this. And so did the police officer who responded. Property destruction and threats are criminal matters, he said, slipping the note into an evidence bag. We'll investigate. The next morning, things escalated even more. Flyers appeared on every mailbox, claiming I was destroying property values. Neighbors split into factions, some siding with Margaret, others with me. A local news van parked outside my house, the reporter saying she got an anonymous tip about HOA terrorism. Then came the worst blow of all. I had just finished speaking with the news crew when my phone buzzed. A text from the Johnsons. Check Margaret's shed. We saw her dragging something there earlier. A horrible chill ran through me. I bolted to my backyard, and my heart stopped. My dog, Max, was missing. I barely had time to think before I was calling the police again. This time, Officer Rivera arrived. Margaret answered her door at a robe, feigning confusion. This is harassment, she protested. But when the shed door opened, Max bolted out, dehydrated but alive. And for the first time, Margaret looked nervous. The security footage from the Johnsons' house showed it all. Margaret luring Max with treats, carrying him to her shed, locking the door. That was the final straw. By the next day, 3 more board members officially turned on her, and my lawsuit against her gained even more traction. Margaret had played her final card, but she didn't realize she had just sealed her own fate. The storm had settled, but a different kind of unease hung in the air. Margaret had gone too far. Threats, vandalism, and now stealing my dog? She wasn't just desperate. She was dangerous. I had barely slept when I got into my car the next morning. My mind was racing through every legal step Elaine and I had prepared. Every piece of evidence lined up against Margaret. I turned the ignition. Something felt wrong. The brake pedal sank to the floor with zero resistance. Heart hammering. I yanked the emergency brake just in time to stop myself from rolling into my front fence. My hands trembled as I climbed out of the car and crouched down. A small puddle of brake fluid gleamed under my vehicle. Someone had cut my brake lines. My pulse pounded. There was no doubt in my mind who was behind this. I called Officer Rivera, who arrived with forensics within the hour. As he knelt by my car, he frowned. The cut is fresh. Someone did this in the last 24 hours. I exhaled sharply. Can you prove who it was? Rivera nodded toward my security cameras. Let's check the footage. I pulled up the recordings on my laptop, and there she was, Margaret Wilson, at 2:13 a.m. She moved with calculated precision, glancing over her shoulder as she crouched near my car. Then her bare hand gripped the underside of the vehicle. Clear as day. A perfect fingerprint. Rivera's eyes widened. This just went from property damage to attempted harm. And given your lawsuit, it's a direct act of intimidation. Margaret hadn't just threatened me. She had tried to silence me. But all she had done was tighten the noose around her own neck. All rise. Judge Reynolds entered the packed courtroom, her expression unreadable as she sat behind the bench. Margaret sat across the aisle from me, dressed in pristine white, as if wearing the color of innocence could wash away her crimes. Elaine stood first, her voice sharp as a blade. Your Honor, what began as an HOA dispute crossed into criminal territory when Margaret Wilson took the law into her own hands. The courtroom fell silent as she played the security footage on the large screen. Margaret, directing the concrete truck. Margaret, ordering the workers to pour cement into the well. Margaret, tamper with my car at 2:13 a.m. The air in the room turned electric. Margaret's lawyer cleared his throat. My client was acting within her authority as an HOA board member. That's false. The interruption came from Thomas Reed, the HOA president. He stood up, his face red with anger. The board never approved the destruction of the well. Margaret showed us altered paperwork. Elaine turned to the judge. Your Honor, we have the original documents proving this well was protected under historical preservation laws. Margaret knowingly destroyed a legally protected structure and interfered with established water rights. Judge Reynolds folded her hands. Ms. Wilson, did you consult with the Water Authority before sealing this well? Margaret stammered. That wasn't necessary. It was just an eyesore. The judge's eyes narrowed. A functioning well is not just a structure, Ms. Wilson. It's a legal water source. By destroying it, you violated riparian rights, committed willful property damage, and falsified board records. Margaret's lawyer scrambled for a counterargument, but then the forensics report came in. Your Honor, forensic analysis confirms Ms. Wilson's fingerprints were found on the plaintiff's vehicle, directly connected to the brake tampering. Margaret's mask cracked. She shot up from her seat. He's been tormenting me. That well ruins property values. I was protecting our neighborhood. The judge slammed her gavel down hard. Control yourself, Ms. Wilson, or I will have you removed. A tense silence followed. Then the judge sighed. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The ruling was swift. $175,000 in damages. Full restoration of the well, covered by Margaret and the HOA. A restraining order requiring Margaret to stay 100 feet away from me and my property. Immediate removal from the HOA board. Margaret collapsed back into her chair, her face pale as death. But just as I stepped toward the courthouse exit, she hissed something that sent a chill down my spine. You think you've won? Your grandfather wasn't who you think. Ask about the Henderson property deal in '76. He wasn't so innocent. I froze in place. Henderson? I had never heard that name before. But something told me Margaret had just revealed a secret buried even deeper than my well. Days after the ruling, a construction crew arrived to remove the concrete from my well. By noon, a worker called me over. You need to see this. At the bottom of the well, wedged into a side chamber, was a sealed metal box. The foreman scratched his head. Whoever hid this didn't want it found. My hands trembled as I pried the lid open. Inside were old property deeds, legal agreements, black and white photographs. My breath caught as I scanned the Henderson name, the same name Margaret had taunted me with. These documents revealed the real reason Margaret had been obsessed with destroying my well. Her father had committed real estate fraud in the 1970s, secretly using other people's properties as loan collateral. And my grandfather had been the only one who could prove it. Margaret had been fighting for property values. She had been trying to erase the one piece of evidence that could expose her family's crimes. And she had failed. 3 days later, we were back in court. Elaine laid the newfound documents before the judge, explaining their significance. Your Honor, these deeds confirm that Ms. Wilson's family acquired land under fraudulent terms. Their actions voided their ownership claims by destroying natural features, including not just my client's well, but the Johnson's Pond and 6 other historical sites. They violated legally binding covenants. Margaret's new lawyer looked sick. Your Honor, he tried, my client had no knowledge of these agreements, except she signed documents acknowledging them when she inherited the house. Elaine cut in. The judge sighed, rubbing her temples. The court finds these covenants enforceable. Ms. Wilson must vacate her property within 30 days. Margaret let out a choked sound, her face twisted in fury. This isn't over, she spat. You have no idea what's coming. But I did, and for once, she was the one with everything to lose. Margaret was forced to leave. The HOA dissolved entirely. It was replaced by a heritage committee meant to protect historical elements, not destroy them. On the day the restored well pumped its first clean water, neighbors gathered in my yard. Thomas handed me an old letter hidden behind the original HOA charter. It was from my grandfather, dated 40 years ago. If you're reading this, someone has likely challenged the well's existence. Water brings life, but also reveals truth. What's buried isn't always gone. Sometimes, it's just waiting for the right time to resurface. And just like that, the well had done what it always had. It had brought the truth to light.